From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, folks. My name is Norman Middleton. I'm one of the concert producers here at the library, and I'd like to welcome you all to our final Music in the Brain discussion this season. But don't worry, we'll have more brains next season, so stay tuned. Just keep an eye out on the website and for our upcoming brochure. Our Music in the Brains lecture series is sponsored by the Music Division and the Science and Technology Division here in the Library of Congress, and the entire series is underwritten by a grant from the Dana Foundation. Before we begin, would you guys please turn off your cell phones and your pagers or put them on vibrate? Thank you very much. Tonight we have cognitive psychologist Michael Kubovy and composer Judith Shatin, both of the University of Virginia, who will discuss the mind of the artist and how composers incorporate extra musical elements in their compositions. Michael Kubovy is a professor of cognitive psychology at the University of Virginia, and he has taught at the universities of Illinois, Yale, and Rutgers. He received his PhD from the Hebrew University at Jerusalem. He has published several books, including The Psychology of Perspective and Renaissance Art, and he has written scientific articles on decision-making, visual perception, and auditory perception. Dr. Kubovy has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation's Study Center at Bellagio, Italy, and he has been elected a fellow of the Society of Experimental Psychologists, the Association for Psychological Science, and the American Psychological Association. And he has been a senior research fellow at the Riken Brain Sciences Institute in Japan. Dr. Kubovy has received grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Mental Health, the National Eye Institute, and the National Institute of Deafness and Communicative Disorders. He is currently working on a book called Pleasure. Judith Shatin is a composer, sound artist, community arts partner, and educator, and her music is animated by responses to the world around her, both in topic and timbre, whether acoustic, digital, or combinations of the above. She is currently William R. Keenan Jr. Professor and Director of the Virginia Center for Computer Music, which she founded at UVA. Her pioneering work and interdisciplinary interests have resulted in appointments as Senior Fellow in UVA's Center for Literary and Cultural Change and Associate Fellow in the Institute for Advanced Computing in the Humanities. Ms. Shatin is a sonic explorer whose music spans chamber, choral, dance, electroacoustic, installation, multimedia, and orchestral genres. Her music has been featured at the Aspen, BAM, Next Wave, Grand Teton, Havana in Spring, and Moscow Autumn festivals. Her music is widely performed and recorded and has been commissioned by the Ashlawn Opera in Charlottesville, the Barlow Foundation, the Kronos Quartet, the Library of Congress, and the National Symphony. Her upcoming projects include Jefferson's Journey for narrator and orchestra, commissioned by a 4-orchestra consortium for the 2009-2010 season. So, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Kubovy and Judith Shatin.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to first say something about this title, The Mind of the Artist. The Mind of the Artist is the name of a course that Judith and I taught 3 times at the University of Virginia. It was supported by a grant called Teachers for a New Era, with funding from the Carnegie Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. And essentially the idea was to offer the students an integrative course that would cover different disciplines and prepare them to be broad and deep teachers in the K through 12 educational system. Today's lecture is going to be in two parts. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about research on music and the brain, and then Judith will illustrate and amplify some of the points that I have made by talking about her own music. The topic that we've chosen is the topic of meaning in music. Now, this is a very rich topic that has a long history. People have often considered any music that has extra musical connotations to be somehow abased, debased, less than pure. Our claim is that such music that does not provoke associations of one kind or another is extremely unlikely to work. And so what I'm going to do is to give you some idea about the research that has been done to support the idea of the relationship between music and language. And then I'll turn it over to Judith. I'm going to start with an illustration of the fact that there are mechanisms in the brain that we have no control over. And I'm going to claim that some of these mechanisms indeed play a role in music. So to start our exercise, what I'm going to ask you to do is to read out loud as quickly as you can not the words, but the colors in which the words are printed. Now, the first two lines consist of words whose color corresponds to the name of the word, the word itself. So red is printed in red, blue is printed in blue, so it's very easy to read blue, red, blue, orange, purple, orange, blue, green, red. But now I'm going to ask you to try to do this and do it out loud, please. I'm going to ask you just to say the names of the colors. Don't read the words, please. Just the names of the colors. Go ahead. Thank you. Okay. So the laughter shows that the point has been made, that you actually can't control the semantic processing involved in the word. You can't just say the name of the color without seeing the word and in some sense reading it. And so you have two processes going on. One process that is voluntary, that is, you are trying to say the name of the color, but at the same time there's another process that runs off not under your control, and it's a process that involves reading, which triggers a word in your head, and that word interferes with your saying the name of the color. So this is called the Stroop effect, and it's a very well-known effect, and it's one that cognitive psychologists use very often in order to confound their participants in their experiments. What I'm talking about is a well-established fact by now that the mind and the brain on which the mind runs, consists of at least two systems. One called System 1, very imaginatively, and the other called System 2. But one of them is implicit, not under your control. Things run off automatically. And the interesting thing about that system is it evolved in order to trigger responses to danger. In other words, it responds quickly, automatically, and is not amenable to your control. On the other hand, the System 2 that involves explicit knowledge is designed to evaluate signals from the implicit system. So you get scared in the night and you say to yourself, don't be silly, this is nothing. So at the same time, the implicit system learns very slowly. It's sluggish. And for good reason, because you want not to unlearn signals to danger. On the other hand, the explicit system learns very fast. And I might come back to that in the question and answer period if the appropriate question comes up. So, let me move toward art and the question of music. So let me read this quote. If all meanings could be adequately expressed by words, the arts of painting and music would not exist. They're values and meanings that can be expressed only by immediately visible and audible qualities, and to ask what they mean in the sense of something that can be put into words is to deny their distinctive existence. I could multiply the quotes in that spirit. And my purpose is to somewhat undermine this claim. To do that, I'm going to describe what is called a priming experiment. A priming experiment involves presenting a list, for example, a list of words. And I ask the participant to read off these words as quickly as possible. Now, the word sofa is written in red to indicate that it's preceded by a word of related meaning. So couch is related to sofa. On the other hand, car is preceded by hammer, which is not particularly related. Another subject, on the other hand, might get sofa preceded by the word disc, or car preceded by the word truck. Now, it turns out that if you measure the time to say the word, then sofa in red, that is the one preceded by couch, is said more quickly than sofa preceded by disc. And the reason is that there's an associative network that runs off automatically. When you see the word couch, things that are associated with couch are primed, are prepared. You access that information more readily. On the other hand, car preceded by truck produces a faster response than car preceded by hammer. So now you know what a priming experiment is. Now, to introduce the experiment that I'm going to talk about, I want to talk about an experiment that involves recording EEG, electroencephalogram. And the electroencephalogram, here you see a participant wearing a cap containing 256 electrodes, which are recording the brain activity from different regions of the scalp. So what happens is that there is a voltage that is produced by the activity in the brain. That is, voltage is amplified and then recorded into a computer, or in the olden days onto a chart. Now, the experiment that I'm going to talk about uses EEG but takes one more step. Imagine a situation where a person is connected to an EEG machine, and the word dog is presented on the screen several times, one after the other. So you can see dog, and you see the wave, and dog, and you see the wave, and et cetera, et cetera. And you record that for a fairly large number of times. Then you take all of those events in the brain and align them with the moment of the event, that is when the word dog appeared, and you average them, and what comes out is an averaged event-related potential. So you can extract out of the noise of the EEG, you can extract what the brain is actually doing. Now it turns out that there is one component of the ERP, the event-related potential, that occurs about 400 milliseconds, 4/10 of a second, after the event. That's called the N400 because it happens to be negative. That is, the voltage is negative. Now, this component is elicited by unexpected stimuli. So, for example, if I said, I like my coffee with cream and dog, you would get a big N400 component because you weren't prepared to process dog, you were prepared to process sugar. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about a priming experiment with the N400, and there it's exactly analogous to reaction time. In other words, sofa preceded by couch produces a smaller N400 than sofa preceded by disc, and likewise car preceded by truck produces a smaller N400 than car preceded by hammer. In other words, the N400 indicates the amount of processing that you need to do given the previous context, the previous information. All right. Now, an experiment by Kölsch and his colleagues. Kölsch is at the Max Planck Institute of Human and Cognitive Brain Sciences, and the experiment is absolutely lovely. So, we do this priming experiment in two different ways. We prime the word wide on the right in the black square. This was done in German. So we prime the word wide or wideness with either music or with a text. So we might say to the participant, the gaze wandered into the distance. I'm translating, of course. So you might say that, and then wide is suggested by the gaze wandering into the distance. However, the strange sentence, the manacles allow only little movement, does not suggest wideness. In other words, the word wide or wideness should produce a higher N400 if it follows the manacles, the handcuffs sentence, rather than the gaze wandering into the distance. Now, the other experiment is, and let me just point out here, you can see that that's exactly what happens. That is, this is the N400, and the N400 is much bigger for the case of the light, the violet is much larger for the violet than for the one that produces the expected result. So the results are exactly as expected. Now the question is, what happens with the music? So instead of giving a sentence, they used, from Richard Strauss, the following. On the other hand, they played And lo and behold, the results were identical. That is, if you look at the intensity of the N400 for the Richard Strauss, it's much smaller because the participants expected wideness. In other words, you can get the same effect with music influencing the amount of processing that you need to do of a word. You can get the same magnitude of effect as with a sentence. So that suggests that music and language are far more closely related than one might have expected. Let me just give you two more examples, and you'll be the judge. Is this a blossom or a staircase? Oh, sorry. And is this bird or king? And all these were part of the experiment. Now, there are various issues with this experiment that are worth remarking on. The first one is that, in fact, the brain areas activated by language and music do overlap quite a bit. So, on the face of it, it's quite plausible that they are marshaling similar resources. However, the story that they're telling is probably incomplete because they chose examples that are particularly effective in making the point that they were trying to make. So some musical meaning works by imitation, cuckoo in Beethoven, or by association. For example, in this case, you have to know that a fanfare is associated with royalty. You can have a sense of embodiment, that is, in order to produce this kind of sound, you would have to move in a certain way that corresponds to a physical assent. And finally, the physical cause, and I'm going to skip that. But I want to finish with one example, one final example. I ask you, tell me if the shape on the top, whether the name of it is Takete or Maluma. Who thinks that the shape on top is called Maluma? Who thinks that it's Takete? Okay, so clearly, there is something going on that has to do with a cross-modal effect that is perhaps it's because you need to be percussive to say takete, and you have to be making sharp changes in order to draw the bottom pattern, that the correspondence becomes obvious. I'm going to leave it at there, and I'm going to ask Judith to come up and continue.
Well, as a composer, you can imagine that these issues are very live for me, and in fact, I've been very intrigued for many years as to how we parse what we hear, how we group it, and in thinking about what I want to create, those questions are very live. And I particularly like that last example of the Takate and Maluma, because I think those are very relevant to musical shapes. And whenever you're listening to music, you are at some level identifying with and thinking about those shapes. Now, as Michael was mentioning, there are several different kinds of relationships between music and our experience. One is imitative, but even imitative is really kind of abstract at times. So what does it really mean? We were talking earlier about Peter and the Wolf and the use of the flute as demonstrating the sound of a bird. Well, why does it do that? And in that instance, the lightness of the sounds, the way that they're separated, and the register, they sound high, they fly high the way a flute does. So there's a link made there. Now, I thought in my own music, since I have to deal with these issues, that it would be interesting for you to hear me kind of talk you through how I've done it in a couple of different instances. And I'm going to start with a piece that has perhaps the most direct reference to an extra musical element, in this case that of the clock. This is a piece called Fledermaus Fantasy, based on some melodies from the wonderful Strauss operetta. And at this moment in the opera, the protagonist doesn't recognize his wife, this is a story of misidentity, at a ball, and is trying to seduce her by hypnotizing her with a clock, a stopwatch. And what I've done in the piece, you're going to hear that it starts quite slowly, and you're going to hear the kind of tick and tock. That will be obvious. But as it goes, it becomes more kind of wound up in the musical fabric. And I want to ask you to try and listen for how the tick-tock of the opening starts getting played with in the violin and speeded up quite dramatically. Okay, that gives you an idea of that one, and it of course engages the idea of the clock in a very humorous way, making a kind of ironic commentary. Of course, the wife is not fooled by this. So in that instance, I start with something that is imitative and then transform it as I go along into something that becomes much more part of the musical fabric. And maybe you're not aware of it in such a direct way, but it is certainly still there and being played with. Now, there's so many different ways in which we can shape the relationship of music to our experience, and sometimes very directly, as in that instance. The next excerpt I'm going to play for you is very, very different. It comes from a piece called kairos, which is a Greek word that means moment of opportunity or a propitious moment for setting out on a journey. And this is a piece for flute and interactive electronics. And what you're going to hear is that this does not sound like the flute bird in Peter and the Wolf, far from it. And so I will play this first. It's a brief excerpt, and then I'm going to tell you the kind of things I was thinking about in composing it. Okay, so in that instance, I was thinking of the idea of starting out on a journey and of sort of calling the journey into being. It's not a fanfare the way the example was before that you heard, but it has something of the heraldic about it. And that is created, I think, by not only the register, but by the kind of assertiveness of the sound, the held nature of the sound, and the fairly regular rhythm of that sound. So again, this may be not something that you listening to it would immediately pick up on, but I think you would hear it as a call to start something, which in this case is a piece that's very much about a journey. Now, it's one of the things for me about composing is that I love words, and I am frequently inspired by words to think of musical images and musical shapes. And this is very much the case for the excerpt that I'm going to be playing for you now, which is from a piece called Tower of the Eight Winds that was commissioned and premiered right here at the Library of Congress in December. And it was on a concert honoring the work of Elliott Carter, who was fascinated by aspects of time. And the Tower of the Eight Winds is an ancient tower that still exists in Athens beneath the Acropolis. And it was built over 2,000 years ago. And at the time, there was a very advanced water clock that worked in it. And you could also tell the time because there were sundials all around the 8 sides of the window of the building. And I decided to play with the idea of the friezes at the top of the building, which showed the gods of the winds. And I named my pieces after different winds. And let me play this brief excerpt for you. I think you will probably get the idea of what the wind is, but I will tell you after. Okay, so I think you probably got that this is a very narrow kind of sound racing along, and this in fact, and that there's a kind of thinness to it, which you might hear as being somewhat cold, I'm not sure, but I think, how many of you heard that as a narrow kind of sound? Yeah, okay. So this is named for a wind that races down from the mountains to the ocean. Now, I didn't need to give it that kind of name. I didn't need that extra musical tag for you to get that kind of shape has a very definite kind of colored meaning for us. So I think, to me, one of the things that's so exciting about composing music is that whatever the music is, I think that there are aspects of narrative that we tell ourselves about it and we very much identify with shapes. We hear things like jaggedness, we hear things like smoothness, we hear things like bounciness. There are many different ways that we can describe what we hear in music. I have just a couple more examples to play for you. This one is from a beautiful poem by the 5th century Chinese poet Su Wei. Can you all see the words? Okay, well, it's very short, so maybe I'll just read it to make sure you can hear them. It's midsummer and too hot to walk. My thoughts are tight as tangled silk. I take a boat and drift among the lilies and scatter them in rose hibiscus lake. And I'd like you to pay special attention to the sound that you're going to hear that's in a kind of thin band on top. It's quite quiet, and I will try and point it out. Now, it's true that composing with text gives you, on the one hand, the opportunity to do what is called word painting, that is to find ways to embody something about the meaning of the words in the sound. It's also challenging to do that. What I was trying to accomplish with that very thin band of sound that you heard, which kind of shimmers, is to give the feeling of looking out on a lake on a very hot, hazy day when you see the light waves, the light rays sort of shimmer off of the lake. There were many other things that I did there in terms of word painting on the word tangled or scatter. And I think that there are ways to kind of amplify what the meaning of the words is. We couldn't do that if we didn't have this kind of priming opportunity that Michael was speaking about. So we know what the word scatter means. We have an idea of what it sounds like when things are scattering. And so you can do that musically as well. So I think there are many opportunities, whether you're working with text or whether you're creating music that has absolutely no program at all, because you're still creating shapes, you're still creating contours, you're still using dynamics. So there's a tone of voice to whatever the music is that you are hearing. And I think all of these are things that many composers are very conscious about when they're working. So there are many different levels on which one works. I have one more, well, I can't do them both. Okay, I'm just going to do one more example. This one also is texted, and this is a very, unfortunately maybe appropriate poem for the times we live in. This comes from a set of pieces I did called Songs of War and Peace. It's from a wonderful book called After the First Rain, of poetry written after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And how my brother is Cain, those who walked to weep, those who walked to write, and I walked and walked and walked, and under my feet words hummed, and I walked over the dark, and over despair, and over silence, and a demon walked through my heart, and the gun, and there was a shot, and years collapse, and how my brother with blood on his hands, and how my brother is Cain, and I walked and walked, and there came a fire consuming the silence. What I would like to have you listen for here is the rhythm of the opening and what it brings to mind for you, and anything else that you hear about how the words feel embodied in the music. Oh, wait a sec, this is the wrong. Sorry, for this one, I'm going to have to go over here. So in this one, again, there are many instances of my efforts to embody what those words are. And the rhythm that I asked you to listen for in the opening, I think of as a rhythm that is kind of like a limping walk, a broken walk. And the idea there was to try to embody something about the pain that's expressed in the words here, in the type of walk that it is. So again, there are just a kind of infinite variety of ways in which composers can, through music, speak to us about our experiences, and we're not always even aware of exactly what perhaps is being accessed. But as in that beautiful example of the Takete and Maluma, it's certainly there. I'd like to invite any questions you may have and ask Michael to join me up here so we can respond to any questions you might have. Thank you.
One question comes to mind listening to the last example, and that is, why did you not include in any of this Schubert's accompaniment, say, for the Erlkönig? Because that is right, or Gretchen am Spendrade.
Okay,
These
that's
examples
a very...
which would have been a little more easy, perhaps.
Okay, perhaps you're right. I made the decision that since I'm a composer myself and deal with these issues, to try and give you a sense through a contemporary framework of how these ideas work. You're absolutely right, those are gorgeous examples, and I know we're going to hear the New Zealand String Quartet play some Schubert tonight, and it will be interesting to keep some of these issues in mind, what the shapes and the colors that he uses bring to mind in terms of embodiment of physical experience as well as associations that you may have. Other questions?
I would say that nothing that we've said is disrespectful of the great music that you're referring to.
No, that wasn't the idea. But I'm thinking that you're a creative person, so you want to relate it to your creative experience and how the process works with the mic. How the process works with you and others in the creative field. But if you've taken something, example of something that's gone in the past, and then try to apply your present experience, present knowledge, with the extension of knowledge, with all the technical skills that we've acquired, it would make us, perhaps, understand Schubert or Saint-Saëns as Rue d'Omphale, or whatever it is, a little more, an experience which we could relate to. And I didn't know there was Schubert on the program. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, you will have the opportunity to experience that very shortly.
Thank you.
As I was listening to your program, which I really appreciate tonight, I was thinking about a piece which for me is fairly abstract. I couldn't identify what associations I've had. It's Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. It's been used and abused in film scores, but with a variety of different associations. I've seen it used for a love scene. I saw it used well in Platoon for struggles. How do you account for music like that has a variety of associations?
That's a very interesting question and a very good example. Certainly, I think that any of us who are familiar with that piece think of the kind of beautiful stretchiness of the melodies and the way it very gradually unfolds. And I think there are many different experiences that sort of work in that way. And so it could be used for a number of different kinds of scenes. And you also bring up another issue that the fact of the possibility of multiple uses brings to mind, and that is that although music can have associations, and I think we would all agree about the kind of very slow, beautiful unfolding of the melodies in that piece, the exact elements that they can be associated with are going to vary for all of us. And so there are certain there are certain occasions where you obviously would not want to play that piece. It's not a lighthearted piece, it's not sparkly. It has certain kinds of connotations. So, but there are many different situations where that would certainly work.
I would like to add that one of the purposes of what we've done is to restore legitimacy to a certain kind of musical analysis that for a long time had fallen into disfavor. So musical analysis very often is presented in terms of chord progressions or in terms of various technical devices that have been used. I think that what we both think is that music as experienced is not all of its technicality. It has various kinds of meaning implications, various kinds of associations. We want to restore the legitimacy of that kind of analysis of music.
In a way, we have been somehow forced to think about music, for example, the four seasons of Vivaldi. We have to think spring, summer, all of that. In the 20th century, then dissonant music was associated with fear and some horror movies, and somehow we have been programmed to think that way, but were the original composers doing it for that reason, or were they just thinking in a very abstract way, and we just somehow adopted it and morphed it, and now we all tend to think about it?
Well, one of the things that's so interesting is how often composers create pieces that others then hang titles on. And I always find that extremely intriguing. But, you know, I think that there are, when you're mentioning how certain kinds of music got associated with fear or anxiety, we respond, for instance, to loud sounds, to sharp sounds, because that can be a signal of danger. So I think that there are some very sort of low-level ways in which we respond to certain kinds of sounds. Now, the other example, the Vivaldi, is really association. I think you're told enough times what it is. I think it's a very interesting experiment to do, to go listen to a piece that you have had that kind of association, see if you can consciously drop it and what else it evokes, because there's a lot of color there that I think you would find may spark some other kinds of associations for you.
Yes, hello. Listening to the last piece, And How My Brother Is Cain, reminded me of, I'm over here. Hi. It's reminded me of a film score, and I was wondering whether you were familiar with it, the Orson Welles Othello. It is very much like, I think, what you were doing, and I was wondering whether you were familiar with it.
I'm not familiar with that particular film. I'm certainly familiar with other versions of that piece, but my guess is that as I was attempting in my setting here, that there's a kind of darkness to the coloration that I used, and just from knowing some other Orson Welles films,
I do hope you can get a copy of it, though, and listen to it.
Okay,
Yes.
will do.
You talk a lot about the connection between music and language, and even to the physiological extent of seeing that overlap in the brain. These are both auditory processes. Both of you also talked about shapes and music, and I wonder, is there also that physiological overlap in the brain between processing of visual content and music and sound, and what do you see? You must see a strong connection between them because you both talked about it, I guess.
Let me give you an example of a lovely little experiment where people in an experiment were shown that behind a screen there's a variety of loudspeakers. There's loudspeakers from near the ceiling down to the floor. Then they were covered, and people were played different notes and asked, where is that sound coming from? Now, clearly the results showed that notes, even though they all came from the same speaker. But people who heard high-pitched notes pointed higher than those who heard low-pitched notes. So there are very interesting cross-modal, by modal we mean modality of vision, modality of audition. So we talk about cross-modal influences. They're clearly cross-modal influences. The most striking is in synesthesia, where you have individuals who, if they hear a vowel, see a color. And I actually, in my lab, did an experiment on synesthetics, and they really do see the colors. This is not merely imagined. So cross-modal influences are enormously powerful. And so, yes, shape, location are represented in similar places in the brain. So there are associations of that type. Yes?
Is this on? Good.
Oh, there's...
I had a question about how do you distinguish between what is a shape or an object of language or music and what is something that we have that's come into our common vocabulary, if you will. So for example, in your first piece, the violin with the very rapid 16th notes, we culturally, as the gentleman earlier really pointed out, almost immediately associate that with Vivaldi's Winter, that kind of high-pitched violin thing. To a certain extent, that's evoking our cultural language. And to me, the last piece, the way the chord structure and rhythms were used sounded a lot like an allusion to me to what we used to use in the funeral service. I think it's the Miserere, where we would sing a psalm to that piece of music as a funeral structure, rhythmically structured as we walk to accompany the funeral cortege.
Well, we mentioned several different types of musical representation, and one is associative, and that one is very strongly culturally determined. And I think it's very interesting to look at how those ritualistic, for instance, kinds of musics work in different cultures. We wouldn't know. If we were suddenly dropped, for instance, into a Japanese concert, into a no performance, we would not have that cultural knowledge to be able to interpret. So to me, this is part of the richness of having illusions which one may or may not be aware of during the creative process, but there's a richness there of allusion to cultural memory. And it's, of course, very varied what music people know and what their experiences are. But as Michael was saying earlier, we have a lot of implicit knowledge about how music goes in this culture. And the music that is created in this culture resonates with that in many ways.
I had a question about, I'm on the very far left, your left. I had a question about music that's almost implicitly technical. Do you feel that it's possible to have that? Like, there are certain pieces, Philip Glass is in music in fifths, straight fifths the entire time, or 4 minutes and 33 seconds that have no notes at all, just a stopwatch, or a couple other, some Schoenberg's 12-tone things, where it is almost, they're doing this in a very technical way. They're not really trying to do any kind of any kind of text painting. Well, there's no text, but there's not really trying to evoke anything except doing things technically. Do you feel that it is possible to have a piece that is just technical in that way?
Actually, no. In the situation of John Cage's piece, I think he's very much playing with our and maybe against our expectations. And in the case of the Philip Glass piece, it becomes a kind of play with sense of time and expectation of movement, and when is it moving and when isn't it moving. So, of course, there's a sense in which any music is technical, and a piece like the Philip Glass one that you mentioned is about starting a process that's finished when a certain number of specifications are worked out. But there are still things going on in that in terms of shape that are very evocative of our expectations.
I'd like to add something about minimalist music. I've often tried to describe what minimalist composers are trying to achieve. And it seems to me that they are, to some extent, playing with the fear of boredom. That is, what they're doing is creating repetitive patterns. My experience is that as I listen to certain Steve Reich pieces or Philip Glass pieces, that I'm worried that the repetition is going too far, and by the time I've thought that thought, it has changed enough so that I've started the process of worrying about being bored all over again. And by the time the piece is done, I have had an amazing struggle that is a deep and wonderful experience.
I think we have to stop. Sorry about that. We've got to get you guys downstairs for the concert. Would you please give Michael Kubovy and Judith Shatin another hand?
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.